academic readers are busy, they're
Mhm.
distractible, they have their own ideas. You start a paragraph and they assume you're going left. You actually intend to go right. You really have to pull them to the right.
Hello, welcome everybody to this wonderful episode because I have Dr. Lingard here with me. She is the author of this book, Story, Not Study. Wonderful. I've read it. I've used it so many times, quick nuggets, and high level enough that it helps change your concept.
Let me introduce myself first as a researcher and then as a writer, because I know that many of you are clinician educators, scholars, clinician researchers, and I live in that world as well. I have spent more than 20 years studying healthcare teamwork, in particular, healthcare team communication, and how the way teams communicate affects the way they practice collaboratively. And I've also studied the role of language in education. So when we teach healthcare novices to talk in a certain way, that actually teaches them to think in a certain way and to behave in a certain way. And I've always had this focus on language because my own training is in rhetoric. I have a PhD in rhetoric. Yes, that's a thing. You can still get that past the ancient Greeks. And it really just means that I'm interested in the social functions of language. How do we use language to get things done? So that's me as a researcher. But in the last 10 years or so of my career, I'm spending more and more time doing faculty development to help other researchers and scholars improve their writing, feel better about their writing, and maybe even have some joy or satisfaction in their writing, if you could imagine that as the goal.
Oh, thank you so much. Yes, joy in writing. I used to hate writing, and now I actually really enjoy it. I think when you get better at it, you enjoy it more. I want to start by talking about the common myths when it comes to academic writing or scientific writing. What are the common myths you have seen?
One of the common myths is that good writers are born, and I'm
Mm.
not one of them, and everyone else is.
Right.
So good. I'm sure that once in a while, a good writer is born. Absolutely.
Mm.
But for the most part, people get better at the craft of writing by deliberately practicing the craft of writing. So if people are feeling as though everyone else is good and they've always been good and they're the only ones struggling and there's no hope for them, that's a myth. I have seen hundreds of people get better visibly, incrementally in their writing with the right kind of instruction and deliberate practice. So that would be myth number one. I think another myth that causes us a lot of trouble is the myth that if I know what I want to say, when I write it down, it will be what I want to say. Because a lot of the time when we talk to one another about our scholarship, we're really clear. And then we hand them the written version and they think, but that's not what you said here. So there's this translation that happens between what we meant to say and what we actually wrote on the page. And that translation can be really tricky for people. So the myth that if I know, then I can write, that's not necessarily so.
See, what do you think is the barrier between what I think in the mind and what is written and how people are perceiving my writing?
One of the barriers is that some of the time writing is thinking. We clarify our thinking through the writing. So that's one of the barriers. We don't actually know in our heads. We're sorting through it as we write, and it's becoming more clear to us. I like to make the distinction between writing as thinking, when we're sorting it out for ourselves, and then writing as communicating, when we are clear in our heads, and then we would like to communicate that to someone else. And I think one of the challenges in that part of the translation is not paying attention to some of the fundamentals of coherence and clarity. So our readers get lost in our long labyrinthine sentences. They get lost in long paragraphs that don't have any visible structure. We write complex discussion sections and we don't signpost to say, dear reader, now we're here. Dear reader, now 3 more things. Dear reader, after those 3 things, here's the climax. We need to keep helping them go through, and that would help with readers getting lost in what we thought was clear.
I love the whole distinction between you are writing to think, that's one separate process, and writing to communicate. So I've never ever thought about it that way. And that takes away the pressure because now I'm like, oh, I'm actually only writing to think. And so I know I don't have to be perfect in this version. That's really helpful.
And it can be really helpful to signal that to people that you send your writing to. If you signal,
Mm,
I'm still thinking this through, you're saying, please don't give me sentence level edits. Don't
yes.
tell me passive voice, active voice. I'm still thinking it through. And I think we have a lot of feedback disconnects when people think we've sent them a polished draft. And so they give us
Mm,
that kind of feedback, but that's not actually what we intended them to receive it as.
right, right. Yeah, they now they are not looking at the idea, but just fixing the words. Instead, you want them to be fixing the right things. Earlier, you said that not everybody is born a writer, but I've also experienced where people who are good at their English grammar, they are good at writing, maybe creative writing, and feel like they don't need help in academic writing. But when I eventually read it, it does not have a scientific story. Do you see that much in your experience?
Yeah, and I guess if I was going to frame that as a myth, I would say the myth
Mm,
is that control of English grammar is sufficient for clear, compelling writing.
mm,
I can read a paragraph that has no grammatical errors and yet is impenetrable. I
mm.
cannot understand what the argument is. So grammar is necessary, but it's not sufficient for good writing.
In your mind, what is really important for good academic writing then?
I think one of the main techniques that I use is always thinking about the reader. What
Mm,
is the effect of this, whatever it is, this opening paragraph, the way I'm organizing these figures in the results, the way I've organized the literature review, what is the effect on the reader? And I always remind people that academic readers are busy, they're
mm-hmm.
distractible, they're unpredictable, they have their own ideas. You start a paragraph and they assume you're going left, you actually intend to go right. You really have to pull them to the right. They're leaning
Mm.
left the whole time because they have their own position in the argument.
Yes.
So thinking about the reader, I think, is really key.
Oh yeah, I what you said about assumption, and sometimes I even title, when you read the title, I assume that's what, like I already assume the type of study, I assume what sort of results. And so you're absolutely right. And the way you frame your maybe even the first paragraph is so important. Like, oh, this is not the direction we're going for.
Well, and we all have the experience of getting reviewer comments, and you think, where did that come from? That is not what I said. I use those moments, I go back into my text and I ask myself, where did I let that reader get off in that direction? Because I must have
Mm,
opened a little garden gate for them and they swung it wide and went through it and interpreted this other thing. So whenever I get a review and I think, I didn't say that, I think, well, but I made possible that misinterpretation somehow.
how do you identify that? So walk us through, you see the review, and how do you know that, okay, I actually kind of open up uh, the garden, as you said? How do you identify that?
I'll give an example
Mm,
of methodology. So I do primarily qualitative research. And as a qualitative researcher in health professions education, I'm going to get some qualitative reviewers and I'm going to get some quantitative reviewers who are
mm,
interested, knowledgeable, but not qualitative experts. I might get a review back that says something like, it should be indicated as a limitation that the results are not generalizable. And I'll think, of course, the results aren't generalizable. That's not what this research does. But I look back to see, did I use a word like, these findings represent, let's say, and that
mm,
verb represents, open up a folder for that reader of everything associated with a population sample that represents,
mm.
what I see where I'm going. So
Yes,
even
yes.
this one word, I look and I say, oh, that's where that generalizable comment came from.
Oh, okay. So, okay, I get you. So basically, sometimes the words, we associated certain words with certain methodology, certain words, signals, something. And before they even look through the rest, they kind of assume, when I see that this word, it means this. And so we have to go back and be really careful with the words we choose and be really precise. And what I get from you.
Yes, I talk to writers about
Mm.
worry spots in their papers. So worry spots are places where you think the reader could resist me here or get off course. Methodology is one of them. The reader could misunderstand my method. Your fundamental premise is another one. If they just don't buy the fundamental premise that would make this question a relevant question to ask, if I'm worried about that, then I'll look really closely at the language in that section to try and keep the reader on track where I want them to go.
Oh my goodness, this is amazing. I'm getting so many tips right now that I don't pay enough attention to the worry spots. And I think we may have experienced this before where I think the reviewer is going to ask about this, but let us hope they don't talk about it. And then the reviewer comes back and you have 3 reviewers. Hey, why did you not talk about this? So if we instinctively feel there's a worry spot, it's better to just tackle it in the paper.
Yes, and the reason is that as soon as it occurs to the reader, they're pulled in that direction. It colors their reading from that moment on. So I understand why people just sort of put their hands together in prayer position and say, please don't let reviewers notice. But instead, we should look at those moments and say, okay, I expect that they're going to have this wobble. They're going to pull away from me here. This is my moment to proactively keep them on course. Doesn't always work, but I think it's better than just hoping it doesn't happen.
That's true. Okay, wonderful. I want to switch gear a little bit. So we were talking all from the point of view of the writer. What about from the point of view of the mentor? What sort of mistakes you've seen mentors do when it comes to guiding your mentees on how to write better?
I think one of the mistakes that we make giving feedback on others' writing is to rewrite it. And we do that partly to be helpful, trying to move the thing forward. But also, I think we're assuming that if I fix it, they'll look at it, they'll understand what was wrong, they'll understand what the fix is, and they'll do it themselves the next time. In fact, if you thought about clinical situations, that doesn't happen. You have to be able to say to someone, this is the problem. This is the solution. I'm fixing this one. And I do this in comment boxes. I'm fixing this one. And then the other assumption we make is that they can see the other ones, but they maybe can't. So I will highlight when that problem happens again in the draft, I will highlight it and I'll say, this is another one of those. Look at what I did. See if you can do it here. So I think we assume that if we get in and fix the draft, people will be able to glean all kinds of writing learning from that, but it's not always so.
I see. Do you feel like if we do that, the student or the mentee gets resistant when you try? Like, what's your process in teaching the mentees on how to improve their craft?
Well, that is my process usually, is to try and identify, to name the problem. So if it's a one-off thing, I'll usually just fix it. But I'm diagnosing patterns in people's writing. So when I see a pattern, then I will name it for them. I will probably give a link to a resource to say, okay, you persistently use semicolons incorrectly. Here's a resource. I've fixed this one. And then I would probably have to flag the ones that were problematic for the rest of the draft, because they might not be able to tell the problematic ones from the unproblematic ones. So that kind of really explicit feedback is what I try to offer people. Now, sometimes it's really valuable to get in and say, okay, we've had a number of rounds. I've done this. Let me just show you what this paragraph would look like. And I do sometimes try and role model, but I'm explicit in saying I'm role modeling here. I've taught you, you've tried, we've gone back and forth. Let me just take this little chunk and work on it and give it back to you. And then we'll talk about what I did. So I do
I see.
sometimes rewrite.
Right, right. But you were explicit about it, saying, I'm showing this is how it looks before and after. That way they can learn. I see. And do your students feel upset about it when you're fixing all the time? Not fixing, but highlighting all the mistakes. What's your experience? Do they like it that way?
I tell people when they start to work with me
Mm,
that the threshold for an acceptable manuscript is very high. And
okay,
I let them know, I actually quantify it for them. I will let them know we're probably looking at 15 drafts
I see.
so that their expectation is at least a little bit managed. If they
Okay.
think it's going to be 2 drafts, they're going to be really frustrated when we get to 12 and I'm still giving them feedback. So I do try
Mm,
and say that up front for them. It also too depends on, I try and come to an agreement about what we're aiming for. So when you're giving people writing supervision, and everybody does this, they help colleagues with their writing, you have to remember it's not your writing.
mm.
So at some point, it's what's acceptable for the writer, and me as a mentor or co-author to say, yeah, I can live with that too, and you're the lead. It's a little different if it's a graduate student versus a co-author. That's a different relationship.
Oh, actually, you know what? You're really right. Because one is a relationship where you are teaching them, another one is the co-author. So can we dig in a little bit more with a co-author? Sometimes there are different levels in writing. Some are really good, some are not so good. How do you work in such a way that we are not overstepping so much, but still get into a acceptable level to at least to our standards? How do you navigate that?
First, I'll ask them what they want from me, and I'll ask them, do you want to develop your writing, or do you want to write this paper? If you want
Mm,
to write this paper, full stop, then let's just work on this paper. And some of that added stuff about here's a resource and here's the pattern and what you're doing, I just won't do that because it's one paper and this is what they're focused on.
mm. I see. Okay, that's very helpful. Thank you. So I want to ask you how, from somebody who has done so much writing and very productive and research for so many years, what is your writing process? Walk us through how researchers do it. So people who are new can see, okay, this is the real process. And how do you make it fast and effective?
So there are two popular metaphors for writers. One is the writer as a gardener. You
Mhm.
just plant a seed and see what grows. And one is the writer as an architect. You make very elaborate plans before you ever put the shovel in the ground. I'm the second kind of writer. I am a planner. I write outlines.
Mhm.
For my qualitative results section, I'll have an outline and then I'll start choosing the quotes that I think I might use. I have that heuristic problem gap hook for the opening paragraph because I like structures. So if you're a gardener and you just like to sit down and write, and you're working with an architect, your
Mm.
co-author is the other type, it's helpful to negotiate that up front. And you don't need to use the metaphoric words if you think your co-authors would roll their eyes, but you might just say, hey, you're going to write that section, I'm going to write this section. I'm an outliner, I'm going to create an outline. And that person might say, well, I'm not going to. And then when I give feedback on that, I know it was done without an outline. I'm super linear. Like I like my stories to have a beginning, a middle, and the end.
Mhm.
So I like to sketch it out first. So that's me, and everything I do has that kind of structure to it to get it on the page. Once it's on the page, I'm a person who loves the words. I love the words, and I can waste way too much time trying to find 3 verbs in a row that all start with the same letter and have 3 syllables. Like that's the level of preoccupation I have with the words, which is silly, but it gives me some joy. So I let
Mhm.
myself do a bit of that because that gives me satisfaction. But I don't let myself do too much because that just irritates readers when you carry on that way too much.
Mm, I'm the same. I'm planner, outline. I know exactly what argument I want to put in. I don't let people lead me away. So, what about those people who are the gardeners and need to write a bunch of things? When I work with co-authors that way, it tends to have a lot of extraneous stuff. How do you guide them in the next step where, okay, now you have written everything, how do you get into more cohesive paragraphs?
So when I work with gardeners,
Mm.
I like to talk a lot first. Gardeners like to organically produce the ideas. I don't see why that has to happen on the page. That seems to me kind of inefficient.
Mm.
So I do more talking at the beginning and try together to get some kind of a loose structure in the talking. And then their organic approach is at least partly structured. I just find it's really inefficient to work collaboratively with a great mass of stuff that the person's maybe spent hours putting on the page but has no structure to it. Then I just feel like I'm tearing that apart on them, and it seems kind of cruel.
Right.
So talking early is first. The other thing that I do with folks who like to just get stuff on the page, if we can agree on a structure, then I will say, as other things occur to you, some of these people are, but what about this? I want to add this. I say, write it in a comment box, because they're used to writing it the moment it occurs to them. So write it in that moment, but put it in a comment box so that it's not interfering with whatever kind of line of logic is building in this loose structure. And that can be really helpful. I think partly because sometimes writers who write that way, they lose stuff if they don't write it as it comes to mind.
Oh, I like that. So you give them boundaries in a way, but still allow them to express immediately the need to take it out on a paper as soon as the idea comes. So I love this whole strategy of talk it out first, and then let them express freely in a comment. Thank you. Love this. What other tips you have for people who want to learn the process of writing much faster?
I work mostly with busy clinicians and health professionals. So one of my main tips is to give yourself bite-sized writing tasks. I know most of those people don't have a day set aside for writing, but they might have 40 minutes or they might have 30 minutes. And so something like problem gap hook or something like the paragraph exercise in the book, it allows you to take one little chunk and say, well, I'm going to work on these 5 sentences. The other thing that I think is really helpful in that is giving yourself permission to send little chunks to your supervisors or co-authors. You don't need to write the whole draft and send it. You need to send a chunk like the problem gap hook paragraph or like your methods and say, I've just done this chunk and here's the kind of feedback I want. I haven't played with the paragraphs yet. I want to know if I've laid out explicitly and educated the reader where I have to.
I see. You also said deliberate practice. So is that what you mean? Write a small paragraph, or you have even other techniques in terms of deliberate practice?
So being prepared to write what other writing scholars have called shitty first drafts. Write a first draft. Accept that it's not perfect. Send it for that kind of conceptual. Does this hang together? Do you find this compelling? Get it back. Deliberate practice. Try it. Work on it again. Focus maybe more on sentence structure, on that kind of thing. So yes, iterating these small bits towards the whole. Other piece of advice I have for people who want to get better is to, when they're reading in their own academic literature, don't just read for content, read for the writing. So when you see a great opening, look at it again and say, what did they do? When you see a really complex method section that is yet easy to follow, step back and say, how did they do that? Mostly we are reading for content, and we can learn so much if we have this extra kind of layer of awareness.
Yeah, I love that. I geek out on how people write sentences and transition phrases too. And so I was like, oh, I love this phrase, and I'll write it down. They are phrase banks, but I find that if you do it yourself, it saves differently in the brain. When I just take a book and copy, it doesn't stick as well. But if I like it and I write it down and I practice a few times, it just feels differently.
I think the last piece of advice I would have for people, and this is both about getting better, but it's also about allowing yourself to enjoy your writing, is to find your voice. I think
Mm,
one of the reasons that writing is such a slog is that we're all trying to sound like that neutral, disinterested, distant, objective, that scientific default that we think
mm,
we're supposed to sound like. And in fact, we're not. That's one of the problems with scientific writing is it's just so horrible,
mm.
so dull and impenetrable. So if we give ourselves permission, you can't, go to town here. You do want to get this past a reviewer and get it published. But if you give yourself permission to say, okay, there's a moment here where I'd really just like to sound like me, just want to sound like me. Let yourself do that and see if it works. And I think we can get some more satisfaction out of the writing if we're not sort of mimicking a tone
Mm.
that doesn't sound like we care about our research.
Can you give us some examples? Like, I can do that for creative writing or opinion pieces, but you're right. I've never even thought about how to create my own voice. Maybe give us a few examples of boring writing versus your own voice.
So one example, academic writing tends to be very hedged, which means we're always allowing for exceptions. We're tentative.
Mm,
We're polite. So
mm,
one way to insert your voice is to take all the hedging out. So if you started a paper with um, COVID marks the death knell for competency-based medical education. No hedging, no equivocating, no
assertive.
subtlety, just bleh.
Mm,
That because it's not hedged sounds a bit different. Now the other thing in that example, death knell,
mhm.
that's a metaphor. If there are moments where you can use a metaphor, um, then that sounds a little bit different, sounds a little bit distinct. There's a great example in one of Will Bynum's paper where he uses the verb masquerade, something about professionalism. Shame may masquerade as professionalism lapses, something like that. So the
Hmm.
verb is may masquerade. When you put a metaphor in a verb, it doesn't scream out, I'm a verb, look at me. It doesn't
Mhm.
sound like literature, but it gives a different flavor. We don't see the word masquerade
Yeah.
in scientific writing. So suddenly you hear a voice there.
Mm, yeah. I almost feel like there is some feeling in it when you put masquerade in it because the emotion of that person comes out. Not
There's
not just
attitude there.
yeah, yeah, yeah. It's
There's
attitude.
attitude.
Yes.
I think writers can try that. And it's great to have collaborators who will rein you in. I value my collaborators a great deal because they will say to me, you know what? You've had your fun. Now go write the paragraph that's actually going to get published. Which is fine because I satisfied myself with trying, and they've said to me, not here, not in this place. We don't want to hear your voice. We just want the science. So you do have to judge when and where, but
Mm,
it's fun to try.
I'm gonna definitely try that because I think my writing has always been very pitch. It's not assertive. I'll say maybe it could be. I'm never asserting my opinion, which I think in science we should be asserting ourselves a little bit more because that's how you push the edges. That's how you push science forward. When you are assertive and you're confident, then you can convince people. Because when I'm hedging, I'm not convinced myself. And if I'm not convinced, how am I supposed to convince the rest of the scientific world? So I love your method of creating voice.
Yeah, the
Um,
academic hedge has a really important roles for us, but it shouldn't be our default all the time. There should be
mm,
moments where we can exert our voice a little bit more distinctively.
yes, I agree. Any other final tips you have for us?
My final tip is for all of those scholars out there who have that either that half drafted paper in their metaphorical drawer or their folder on their laptop, or the ones that have the rejected submission in the same
Mm,
place. Pull these back out. You're partway there. If you've got half a draft, you're halfway to a full draft. If you've got a reviewed manuscript that's been rejected, you've got a full manuscript with some insights into where you need to help the reader along,
Mm.
convince them differently. I think it's very easy to get discouraged. It's very hard to get writing submitted, and it's very hard to get the submitted manuscripts accepted. But if you've got part of the stuff, pull it out. Don't let it languish for years and years. Pull it out, tackle it again.
Yeah, I think all of us have this old manuscript that takes forever. And I think it weighs on you. I have one that took really long time and finally we finished the manuscript. It's just that the weight is lifted. So you may not think that it doesn't matter. It matters because it will weigh on you for many, many years. And you will feel like, oh, that wasted manuscript, that wasted project. Thank you so much for this advice. So tell us, how can people find you and what's the best way to connect with you?
So people can follow me on Twitter. My Twitter handle is Lingard Lorelei. And I do offer writing courses and writing studios. And, I often tweet little writing strategies. I also write an open access series in the journal Perspectives on Medical Education. And whenever there's a new one of those, I'll tweet about it. So Twitter is kind of the central place to find everything that I'm sharing about writing.
Right. And I agree. The reason I know Dr. Lingard is through one of the workshops we had at our institution through medical education, and it was beautiful. We broke down into groups. We brought our first sentences and she broke it down. It was very insightful. And you can actually see the pattern of how you write. So medical institution groups, if you want somebody who can help conduct a writing workshop, Dr. Lingard is the right person. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm sure the audience are going to learn so much from this. Thank you so much.
It's been a pleasure.
Take care.